Okay, great. Well, I'm just going to introduce myself. My name's Benanav. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Humboldt University of Berlin, and I wrote a book called Automation and the Future of Work. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the themes from that book today. I'm going to talk about this kind of new wave of thinking about automation and the way that the people I call the automation theorists see the world and think about like the major problems that we're experiencing in the economy today. I'm going to give you a little account of what I think is wrong with this automation-based perspective, and then I'm going to show you some of the ways that we can take the more idealist or utopian kind of visionary aspects of the automation discourse and make them in a way much more practical and realizable for the world that we actually live in. So just to get started here with some background, here are just some recent books that have come out about automation. Maybe most recently, A World Without Work by Daniel Susskind. These ideas really broke into the mainstream in the last few years with Andrew Yang, who ran for the nomination of the Democratic Party for president. But basically what unites these books, and they kind of appear really across a wide political spectrum, is the idea that we're living in an age of accelerating technological change, which is going to bring about the end of work as we know it. And the way I see it, there's four major ideas or propositions that guide this automation theory. The first one is they say, look around you. Workers are already being displaced by ever more advanced machines and robots. The second thesis is that this displacement is a sign that we're on the verge of achieving a fully or largely automated society. Automation should entail our liberation from work, but because most people have to work in order to live, this could turn out to be a real nightmare for society. And fourth, the only way to prevent this nightmare of mass unemployment is to implement UBI and transition to a post-scarcity world. Now, the automation theorists cite all different kinds of evidence for this thesis. And of course, it makes a lot of sense when you look at factories like the Tesla production plant, which was in Fremont, California, now moved to Texas, where Elon Musk is pushing towards lights out production with like no actual human beings in the factory. You can also think about all of these recent advances in machine learning, neural networks, the push forward towards artificial intelligence and kind of bringing that into the economy in various ways. And then alongside the emergence of these technologies, they point out really disturbing trends in the economy. Trends like jobless recoveries, the fact that after every downturn in the economy, it takes longer and longer for the people who've lost their jobs to find new ones. And that's what this graph here is showing you. It's just showing you decade by decade, business cycle by business cycle, the economy is taking longer and longer to recover, at least when it comes to working people. And alongside this increase in jobless recoveries, we also see a growing inequality. This divergence, there's a very famous graph of it for the US, this one's for the OECD as a whole, showing that this divergence between wages and productivity. Workers are producing more and more per hour, but their wages are stagnating, and that's causing rising inequality. And then, of course, more dramatically, we've seen the rise of, these titans like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos fighting to be the first people to put a man on Mars, and sending these giant rockets into space over the heads of, coughing and sick people down here on planet Earth. And so the question, which these automation theorists are trying to answer is, what's the connection, on the one hand, between the rise of all of these brilliant technologies, on the other hand, these political and social troubles like jobless recoveries, employment insecurity, rising inequality, and so on. So the question that my book tries to answer is precisely that one. Is automation really responsible for the growing difficulty workers face finding or holding on to jobs? Now, if the automation theorists were right, one of the big claims that I make in the book is that if they were right, we should be able to see evidence of this in the standard economic statistics. It should just be the case that if workers are being replaced more and more by machines, the remaining workers should seem to be getting more and more productive, because the few workers who are remaining employed would now be, working with machines to produce more and more goods per hour. But it just doesn't look like that in the statistics. So here's just a graph of the United States manufacturing sector productivity levels. This is like, how much output per hour you get from a worker in a factory like a Tesla plant, but across the whole sector in the United States. And what you see is that during this time when we've had all of these claims about all of these amazing technological changes that are happening in industry with all of these advanced robotics and so on, productivity is actually totally flatlined in the manufacturing sector and industry. And it's not just in industry, it's actually true for the economy as a whole. Instead of seeing this really dramatic upswing in how much we produce per hour in the productivity of workers, the past decade or two have actually seen the lowest increases in productivity that have been recorded in the post-war period. And here I'm just showing you the US, Japan, and Germany, which are supposed to be some of the most automated economies in the world. And while this is happening, while this productivity slowdown, the opposite of what we would expect, where the automation theorists right, while that's taking place, we're also seeing a really dramatic slowdown in the growth rates of economies as a whole. Like, decade by decade, these big advanced economies are just growing more and more slowly. And that's the phenomenon that I want to point to explain the kind of the themes that the automation theorists are picking up on. So I'm saying it's not that rates of job destruction are accelerating due to brilliant new technologies being brought into the economy. The real problem is that the pace of job creation is slowing down. Fewer new jobs are being created to replace those that are being lost. Now, this is a phenomenon that's kind of, people are starting to talk about it more in the economy, and especially in relationship to the corona pandemic and kind of people starting to talk about what the aftermath of that pandemic will look like economically. What we've seen is that really this trend of slowing economies, what economists call secular stagnation, has been unfolding for a very long time. In fact, about, what is that, 60 years ago, in the 1960s, economies would grow at about 5% per year on average. Even before the corona crisis, the advanced economies were growing at a pace of about 1.5% per year, so less than a third of the pace that they used to grow at. Why is this happening? Why are economies stagnating? Why aren't economies not generating the kind of job growth that they used to generate that was necessary to create stability for most people? So one way to think about this that I talk about in the book, and here I'm just going to give you a really brief introduction to it, has to do with globalization. This graph is just showing that, something everybody knows. Since the 1970s, the world economy has become more and more dependent on trade. And the idea of the economists was that everyone was going to benefit from this trade. Trade was going to, create opportunities for people in every country to specialize, trade with one another, and benefit from growth. But during this period when globalization really dramatically increased, what we saw instead, as I was showing you before, and here this is just really standard economic data from the World Trade Organization, which is definitely not trying to present a bad picture of what's going on. What we see is that growth rates, especially in industry, which is the main kind of sector of the economy involved in world trade, growth rates have just really slowed down significantly. So it's the opposite of what the economists said was going to happen. So why is this happening? My argument is that globalization was supposed to generate trade complementarities, like groups specializing in different things, but instead it generated trade redundancies. Companies trying to compete to produce the same types of goods in ever more overcrowded global markets. And so as productive capacities expanded worldwide, the result was rising industrial overcapacity and slowing rates of investment. So instead of generating a new era of rapid growth, globalization and the technological diffusion it was associated with actually resulted in this long-term slowdown in the world economy. And as that was happening, we saw wave after wave of deindustrialization spread across the world. When people talk about globalization and its effects, they'll say, okay, yeah, maybe countries like the UK, the US, Italy, those countries are deindustrializing. But that must be because all of these jobs are moving to the global south. That's not really true. Even countries like Brazil and South Africa have been deindustrializing now for about 40 years, countries that are experiencing what economists call premature deindustrialization. And then you might think, okay, well, that must be because all of these jobs are moving to China. But actually, China also deindustrialized in the 1990s. So many jobs were lost in China in the 90s, way more than were lost in Europe. It's only in the early 2000s that China, by grabbing much larger shares of the world market, was able to reindustrialize and gain back the jobs that had been lost. But then China also started to deindustrialize in 2013. And in fact, according to the UN, the whole world has been deindustrializing since the early 2010s. So what's really going on here, one aspect of what I'm saying is that with globalization, we saw this really dramatic increase in trade redundancies, slowing investment, basically a lot of jobs in manufacturing either disappearing or not appearing. But what happened alongside of that is that nothing replaced industry as a growth engine for the world economy, especially not in the service sector. People talk about a transition, like we've all seen this, a transition from an industrial to a service-based economy. Most of the people in this room probably work in some kind of service. That's the main thing generating employment in the economy today. But what they don't talk about is that this transition was associated with a slowdown in rates of productivity growth, in economic growth, and in a persistently low demand for labor, by which I mean that people are experiencing widespread job and employment insecurity. So the result is that with this transition from an industrial to a service-based economy, we've seen low rates of growth, high rates of and underemployment, and spreading insecurity and precarity. Meanwhile, and this is a more technical side of the argument that I don't get that into in the book, I would say that machine learning and neural networks, although they are really interesting and transformative technologies, they're just not going to produce the breakthrough to generalized artificial intelligence that would be required to kind of get the economy technologically out of this rut. So how does this view on the problem change our sense of the politics? If the problem isn't that brilliant new technologies are spreading through the economy, turning everyone, replacing everyone with robots and computers, and creating a world where there's just an immense amount of goods, but no one has the money to buy them. What if that's not the story? What if it's really about slowing growth and stagnating economies that can't create jobs? How does that change our view on things? Well, a big part of the automation story has been this idea of UBI. And that was also the claim that Andrew Yang made in his big presidential run. Humanity first. We have all these machines, now we need to put money in people's hands. And one thing that's really interesting to me is that advocacy for UBI has really expanded across the political spectrum. You have people like Charles Murray, who's an infamous racist who wrote a book called The Bell Curve, that revived all of these racist theories about intelligence. He's been advocating UBI, and then on the other hand, you have people on the far left talking about UBI as a way to bring about a kind of communist future. One of the ways I intervene in this discussion is I say, look, if the automation theorists were right, the main issue we would face today would be one of distribution. The big problem would be that we have so much stuff we're making with robots, but as I said before, no one can afford it. It'd be a distributional problem. We just need to put money in people's hands. My argument is that the problem we face instead has to do with production. It has to do with something going wrong in the way we organize the economy. Production is slowing down, and we can't solve that merely by changing the way we distribute things. So one way to kind of get at that essential difference is to think about how this is a graph of the rate of basically investment, like how much rich, wealthy people and corporations are taking the money they earn and reinvesting it in expanding the economy. And what's happened over time in the course of this big slowdown in the economy is that companies and wealthy people are just investing less and less overall. This is for the United States, but it's also a big problem in large parts of the world. And in response to the threat of that this disinvestment makes for society, what have we seen? We've seen governments making all of these efforts to revive stagnant economies in ever more radical ways. Governments have spent 50 years imposing austerity on populations. And there's a lot of worry that, once the corona crisis sort of is drawing to a close, we're going to see the return of these kinds of austerity again. Governments have been removing labor protections, trying to make it easier, trying to say to companies, look, you can employ people, you can fire them whenever you need, just invest and create jobs. If you can't support these people, you can just get rid of them. And also, governments have been taking on just massive amounts of debt. People talk about the 1950s and 60s as the era of Keynesianism, when governments were spending money to kind of stimulate the economy. But actually, one of the things my book shows is that that's more been a phenomenon of the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and today. It's really in the recent period that governments have been taking on massive debts to try to stimulate the economy. And what we see is that even though they're doing this, it's not really creating the revival of growth that they expect. So a big question that I'm asking is, can we look at this threat of disinvestment in a slow-growing economy? How can we render this threat that businesses and very rich people are making, how can we render that threat inoperative? And also, in a kind of more utopian direction, can we get to this kind of post-scarcity world that the automation theorists are talking about without automation? How can we kind of bring about the better world that these people are describing if the technologies that their story relies on aren't really coming into existence? And in the book, in order to think about that, I look back at a very long tradition, going back 500 years, all the way to thinkers like Thomas More, who wrote Utopia, which I think is a much more interesting and in some ways a more practical book than the word utopia used as a kind of epithet actually implies. One of the lines from Thomas More that I find very inspiring is he said, in Utopia, no one is a pauper or beggar. And though no one has anything, all are rich. For what greater wealth can there be than to be completely spared any anxiety and to live with a joyful and tranquil frame of mind, with no worries about making a living? And I think that idea, the idea that abundance isn't something that requires really brilliant technologies that are going to come one day but haven't appeared yet. Instead, there's an idea in More and in thinkers influenced by him, people like Marx, but also maybe even Keynes, and a whole range of thinkers that I include in a kind of post-scarcity tradition. There's an idea here that abundance isn't about some technological breakthrough. It's a social relationship. It's about creating a society where everybody feels secure that they have what they need, and that really opens up their worlds, and it makes them able to be free in a different way. And the thinkers in this kind of post-scarcity tradition that I refer to in my book, they think about this as something that we can achieve now with the technologies we have, rather than something we have to wait for in order to, we have to wait for artificial intelligence in order to get us there. And so in the book and in a new book I'm working on, I try to think about, what that would look like. Like, how do we get to post-scarcity without automation? And I provide 4 basic ideas for what we would have to do to get there now. One is that we'd really have to re-gear the economy to make sure that everyone gets access to basic goods and services and even basic income, but now integrated into a different understanding of the economy. So, to live in a world where people have access to housing, transportation, communication, education, healthcare, childcare, and so on, that these things would be provided, that they would be guaranteed to people. They couldn't be taken away from them. And then, of course, that raises the question, why would people work in a world where they have these guarantees? And that's always been a claim made. That was something people said about why we shouldn't get rid of slavery, why we shouldn't have a welfare state. You know, all the time, this threat that people won't work is how people with power respond to this dream of a post-scarcity world. But what we know is that actually people can like their jobs. It's just that most people don't like their jobs today because those jobs, they have no control over what that work looks like. They don't know what the purpose is of their jobs. They don't have autonomy in how they carry them out. So we would really have to reorganize work and give people more of a say, and also redistribute work in order to make it so that people have more free time. The third thing that's the most important one in a way, and the hardest to achieve, is that we have to socialize investment. And what that means is that we need to take control over which sectors of the economy grow and which sectors shrink. We have to take that away from finance and corporations and make that into a democratic process where we're actually investing in the parts of the economy that are directed towards helping people feel secure and free in their lives. And the fourth one, also incredibly important, especially because today, right in the era of the end of the corona crisis, or maybe the middle, maybe the end, who knows, we've seen the rise of new kinds of ideas about technocracy. We just need to put the people with knowledge in charge and they'll solve everything for us. I think we have really strong reasons to doubt that any technocratic government is actually going to create an economy that meets people's needs. And that's why it's incredibly important that we democratize the institutions of our society. Not that everything would become one big referendum. Democratizing institutions means looking at all the different parts of society and democratizing them separately, in a sense. So democratizing work, democratizing, involving the users of healthcare, as well as the people who work in hospitals, and figuring out what better ways are to provide that care, and so on. And so I think that, with some work, we can, and facing the, we're coming out of an immense social crisis that our societies were just really unable to handle. And we're facing an even bigger crisis coming up right down the road, the climate crisis. And facing up to these things, we're just going to have to revive these kinds of, and realizable utopian ideals for our society today. And what I tried to do in the book, and what I tried to summarize here for you a little bit, is just the way that we can look at this automation theory and be really inspired by the ideas in it, while also recognizing that empirically, it's just wrong about its claims. It's not that there aren't these new computer and information technologies and robots and so on. Of course, technological change is happening, and those technologies can be used to make a much better world than the one we have now. But the claims that the automation theorists make, I'm saying, are excessive and they're not supported by the evidence. In reality, it's that the economy is stagnating, not that it's growing at an incredible pace due to these technologies being brought into the economy. And facing up to that stagnation, that actually makes it even more important that we think about how to reorganize the economy to create the kind of post-scarcity world that these automation theorists are dreaming of. So thank you so much. That was hopefully brief enough and created some context for discussion and questions. So thanks.
Yeah, but maybe first we can, hello, my name is Kuba Szreder, and we are going to have, now we actually have a really long time for a discussion. So we can also maybe start with asking our audience, maybe some of you have like immediate questions, or yeah, there is already a hand there.
Hi, thank you, Aaron. That was a great presentation. It seems we've just had the best test we're ever going to have for universal basic income, where governments have been paying people's wages throughout Corona. And it seems the results of that have been mass government debt, looming higher taxes, rapid inflation, and a huge labor shortage. And I'm just wondering how the policy is ever going to survive a test like that.
Sorry, you're wondering how...
How the policy of universal basic income could ever survive a test like that with the results that we've just seen.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. I think that in a way, to me, you know, UBI, there's a lot of reasons to support UBI. Especially, I come from the United States, which is, you know, a country built on basically like racist policies. And it was very important in the United States. They really want everything to be means tested. Like they want people to really prove that they need welfare benefits in order to access them because they were trying to prevent poor and black people from getting those benefits. So in a country like the United States, the call for something like UBI makes a lot of sense, right? Universal benefits are something we should really support. But in another way, I think UBI is a kind of cynical approach because it sort of says that there's nothing we can do to kind of reorganize the economy in a deeper sense. We're too scared now to do that work of really intervening and reshaping the economy. Obviously because of the, you know, disastrous legacies of 20th century state socialism and so on. So it's saying, let's just give people money and, you know, let the economy work itself out after that. And I think we're starting to see right now a real change in that, precisely for the reasons that what was your name? Sorry? Precisely the reasons that Phil mentioned. We're seeing, like around the corona crisis, governments saying, hey, we actually need to intervene in supply chains. We actually need to like have more control over the basic structures of our economy. And, you know, 20 years ago, the only solution on the table for the climate crisis was making a market in carbon, like selling carbon credits. Now we're seeing the rise of a new interest in things like the Green New Deal, which is basically like a 5-year plan for even a 10-year or 15-year plan for reorganizing the economy to get it off its addiction of fossil fuels. And so while I think there's a lot of sense in the kind of return of UBI, I think that we're sailing beyond that now. And then in the post-COVID era, you're going to see a lot more interest in revamping and transforming the economy in a deeper way. But what we need to do is we need to make sure that we know what we want that revamping to be for. Like we want it to be for creating a world where we can really meet people's needs and give them the security they need to like expand their worlds and follow their passions. Like we can imagine a much better world. And I'm very worried that the kinds of new interventions into the economy, these very technocratic ones, they're going to be about preserving power disparities in our society, not transforming them. So I think it's a really good point, and I think you're going to see calls for UBI continue, but you're going to see a lot more of this really new ideas about transforming the economy in a much deeper sense.
If you have any follow-up question, just please raise your hand. Or any new question. So maybe I'll just follow up with this discussion about UBI, because basically what you kind of advocate here for is the democratization of the means of production, if I understand you correctly. That used to be called communism or socialism and so on and so forth. So how would you imagine this to happen? Like in terms of political change required to actually socialize investment and provide people in according to the need?
Yeah, I mean,
sorry, it's a big question, you know, but obviously this is an elephant in the room, right?
That is the big question. I mean, I guess that the reason why I use the term post-scarcity rather than socialism or communism is just that I want to estrange us a little bit from these traditions. And I want to show that, you know, the 20th century idea that getting out of capitalism meant central planning and bureaucratic states, that, you know, that's not the only way people thought about that. There's a much longer tradition of thinking about what it would take to get beyond capitalism that, again, goes all the way back 500 years to Thomas More, who was there right at the beginning for the enclosures and the expropriation of peasants, and already at the start of capitalism was trying to think about what it would take to get beyond it. So I'm trying to refocus us on, what the world is that we want to build first, and then the big question, which is like, how do we get there? And partly, I guess, my reason for that is I think believing that another world is possible and worth fighting for is something that many people, myself included, we've been really, even though we want it, we're not really sure we believe that it's possible. And so we need to kind of lay that out first. And then I think once you do that, you develop the capacity for a more strategic orientation. And here, we could talk about what the problems were with central planning and how to envision a form post-scarcity that doesn't rely on that. And I'd be happy to talk about that in more detail if you want. But the strategic question is also about what can we do now, what can we fight for in the here and now, and what will really require radical change to achieve. I think that we can fight in the here and now for much better provision of services and basically the movement for what some are calling universal basic services. We can fight to expand those, we can fight to democratize those, but at some point we're going to confront, as you said, the elephant in the room, which is the fact that rich and powerful people and corporations, they ultimately control the investment function. They decide with their investment decisions whether the economy grows or shrinks. And that ability, that capacity means that they can hold our societies, our economies, and our governments hostage when they try to make big changes. And that's the thing, that's the kind of horizon, the socialization of investment. It sounds so technical, but it's really about removing the power of very wealthy people and corporations to decide whether the economy grows or shrinks. That is going to require a very massive and probably very difficult change to achieve. But we need to set our horizons, the medium term, and then, hopefully not the too long term kind of changes that we need to see.
There is a question.
Okay. Taking it from the socialization of investment point. So this is kind of an old point coming from Keynes and then from Minsky, and nowadays it's coming more and more back with Bellofiore and Mazzucato discussing about it. So I wonder, because you're kind of part of the ultra-left, what we would say, or at least end nodes is kind of this tradition of thought, what would it mean to maintain the concept of investment and the debtor-credit relation and all that it brings about time? Because it gives us, all this thing with investment has an understanding of time that is a kind of different of what would mean in a post-scarcity economy to organize the economy here and now. So I wonder, okay, it's something that you would do in the more, as a first step kind of, and then going beyond. But isn't it also problematic to maintain these kind of elements, like the investment thing?
Okay. Yeah.
Or what could be the danger, on the other hand? What could be the danger of maintaining it? Have you thought about it? Like, what would mean for a society to maintain the idea of kind of getting indebted for its future? And to whom are you getting indebted in a, let's say, regulated financial economy that you have, in a post-scarcity regulated financial economy? What is happening there?
Yeah, so I mean, this might be, for some people, like a very technical question about, how does this relate to like Keynes and Minsky and theories of investment? I mean, these are pretty economic ideas that I'm trying to get people to think about or open them up, right, and make them available to a wider audience. So I'm going to try my best, because this is actually a pretty important question. The way that it's really important to think about how our economy changes over time. I mean, most people they're not involved. Like the vast majority of us have no say in these big decisions about how the economy changes over time, like how fast the pharmaceutical industry is going to grow, and the industrial economy is going to shrink. Like all of these kind of questions are, there's very few people in the room making those decisions. And basically, it's all based around ideas about profit. And that's why when people say things like, people over profits or something, they're actually getting at something really fundamental about what drives change, what does the dynamic work of transforming our society. What I'm talking about in a post-scarcity society, it wouldn't be organized, like these changes that we would make in the way we organize social provisioning, it wouldn't happen through profit. It wouldn't be like we have this money and we're looking for, where's the highest rate of return. We wouldn't be able to use these monetary and financial factors to make these decisions about what our world is going to look like, how we're going to reshape it in the future. And a big question within this kind of small but growing field of thinking about how does social change happen in a post-capitalist society is really about the idea that once you get rid of the profit motive, the advantage is that suddenly you can include all of these other factors in making a decision about what to do. Like, we can think about, in a real way, we can think about the environment, we can think about sustainability, we can think about whether workers are actually enjoying their work. We can think about justice issues, like, is this a region that's been historically underserved or where people are fleeing from, and the infrastructure is declining? Where geographically do we want to, transform our economy and our provisioning process? So you can bring in all of these different factors, not just monetary cost-benefit analysis, but that also makes it really hard to decide what we should do, how to balance sustainability, against worker satisfaction, against efficiency, against, community, and so on. And the claim that I'm making, which obviously I wouldn't be able to develop very much here, is that actually means these become political questions. And instead of having a financial system that in a very abstract and kind of distanced way is determining how our society changes over time, these would have to become political problems that are actually organized in a democratic way. And that's something really different than central planning. And it's something that we can only do today because we have basically this really advanced and interesting information and communication technologies in the internet. But it's not just a technological problem, it's a social and political one. It means we're gonna have to reorganize the governing institutions of our economy to take into account a much wider set of criteria and allowing many more people to participate in that process. And that's difficult. But the advantage of it is going to be that we're actually going to be able to create a world over time that everybody feels actually supports them and where the causes of their suffering and unhappiness are actually being addressed in using the actually immense resources that we have as a society to meet the needs that we have and to allow people to follow their passions. So hopefully that's a little introduction to post-scarcity economics.
Yeah, you write a lot about protocols and algorithms. I assume it's like quite in a tradition of sort of communitarian, associative anarchism, right? Of like free associations of producers and consumers. But and this is an interesting. I mean, it is an interesting point that you are making about the democratization of institutions that was already said here. The thing that maybe I will just play a bit of an devil's advocate, because if we all agree, then it gets a bit boring. Not to say that you said something boring. Actually, it's super interesting, but still maybe to bring it a bit of a dynamism, I will also quote Mirle Laderman-Ukieles, a feminist artist, who in '67 wrote a manifesto for maintenance art, and there she asked a kind of like, I think, perennial question, but you've already mentioned, but maybe we should come back to it, because it's not only bosses and capitalists that ask it, but also feminist activists too. After the revolution, who is going to pick up the garbage on Monday morning? I guess a crucial question, especially like, we also know the feminist criticism of let's say, Marxist ideas about productive labor and so on and so forth. I know that you've dealt with this, but maybe it is a point that you could elaborate upon.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in a lot of ways, the book I wrote, I was very influenced by feminist critiques of work in what I said, but I didn't always bring that out, those influences, as much as I should have. Because I think that, a really core idea from that critique is that, look, we can't just like say, hey, we'll feed and clothe and house everyone, and people just decide what kind of work they want to do. It's just a kind of free for all. It's unstructured in some way. I think that's obviously not what people who are really thinking about these proposals wanted to say. But I think it's an important critique, because I think who picks up the garbage on Monday morning? Who's going to take care of the kids? These are really essential questions. And a society that imagines, I think maybe a version of this that I'm critical of is that all work will become play. We won't need to organize that. That's just never going to be realized. We have to actually take on and reorganize work and make sure that people, contribute to it. And I think that in a capitalist society, the way we get people to make work contributions is to say, if you don't work, you're going to starve. You're going to get kicked out of your house. You're not going to be able to pay your debts. You're not going to be able to take care of your children. And I think that we can get to a world where we don't need the threat of the whip or of homelessness to get people to work. And that means really transforming and reorganizing work, and including what's currently non-economic or unwaged work in the pool of work, the pool of necessary labors that we have to redistribute and reorganize, and also make better for the people doing that work, so that they feel encouraged to work rather than working only through this kind of negative reinforcement of, if you don't show up, you're not going to be able to eat. Now that, that's a dimension that I think, look, that's going to take time to get there, but that's the horizon that we should work toward. And it requires us really thinking about, why do people work? Is it only because of the threat of homelessness that people work? No, that's not true. People get a lot of meaning out of their work, and that can be made a lot of meaning in their lives, feeling like they make a contribution. But our society really dampens and destroys those impulses in a lot of ways. And there's a lot of studies about psychological studies and work studies that show how giving workers more autonomy, more freedom, and more purpose in their work really transforms how people relate to the work they need to do. And I think that's as true for so-called productive labor as for reproductive labor.
Yeah, I mean, here, like, very interesting are these experiments, like, by the New Economic Foundation, kind of like trying to measure the social value produced by a given worker. So, for example, for every pound paid to a nurse, she produces 9 pounds of extra social value. For every pound paid to a trader, possibly he actually siphons additional 100 pounds out of society as a capital for people who hire him in order precisely to do so. So I guess that this is an interesting point in case. But maybe, like, even getting there with this feminist arguments, the question is also about efficiency, I think. Like, this is a very important aspect of the, let's say, of the kind of what Boltanski would call a system of justification of the current capitalist order. They simply say, well, look, communism failed because it failed utterly at production of goods. It's completely inefficient way of organizing society. Capitalism as such, maybe it's not a particularly good system, but at least it's ultra efficient in producing goods and distributing it in a society market and money and private property and profit motive. That's here you have it, right? You also deal with this in a book, but maybe if you could talk a bit about that, because I think this is one of the arguments that most of people here face when they talk about it. And with the follow-up question discussion, I would like to talk with you about externalities. But maybe first efficiency, because I think it is also a very important question that people typically ask themselves.
I mean, look, I think that's a crucial question. And there's two things I would say about it. One is that part of what I'm trying to show you is that actually capitalist economies are not generating the kind of efficiency gains that they used to generate, because those gains were specific to this era of industrialization that's now coming to an end. You know, a lot of the services where people are employed, they just don't see these massive efficiency gains over time. And that, you know, that actually influences why a lot of workers in those fields are getting so pushed down, right? Because employers have to kind of control costs by working people harder and longer and for less pay, rather than relying on the capacity of technologies to make their work ever more efficient. So on the one hand, capitalist economies are just not as good at this thing that everyone said they were good at in the 80s and 90s when, you know, communist countries collapsed. The world we got is obviously very different from the world that was promised, right, when the wall fell. But that said, I am in no way advocating that we go back to the inefficient kind of state socialist and centralized economies, which I think were both economically and politically and ecologically actually bankrupt, right? So what I'm talking about here is a world where we understand that getting beyond the profit motive and organizing the way collectively that we change society over time, which is in these terms about investment, those are the things that we really need to politicize and we need to make decisions about together using many different criteria: justice, efficiency, sustainability, and so on. But when we control that and make that political and technologically transform how we do it, we actually need to leave workplaces, people working, a very wide latitude in deciding how they carry out their work, because that is fundamental to having an efficient economy. Because in order to have efficiency, the people who are at the different workplaces, they actually need to have much more of a say than they had in central planning in deciding, you know, which production methods to use. So I think that we can, by changing how we think about what it is to get beyond capitalism and really getting beyond the profit motive, but without centralizing all economic decisions, we can actually create a much more efficient version of a post-capitalist society that also is actually trying to balance efficiency against all of these other concerns we have that aren't being met. And that's basically the externalities question.
Precisely. And then, here we have it. Like basically, the basic tenet of Marx's argument is that capital does not come from nowhere. It comes from human labor. It was recalibrated in accordance with ecological thinking by, for example, Jason Moore, who says capital accumulation can only happen and seemingly is efficient because it can freely exploit what he called four cheaps, right? It was food, labor, energy, and resources. As long as these ones seem to be endless, capitalism can pretend to be endlessly accumulating. Another interesting argument here is like an argument also of J.K. Gibson Graham, of feminist economists, who say that what we imagine as an economy is just a peak of an economic iceberg. So like what is financialized actually hovers above the huge bulk of non-monetized labor that provides capitalism with a steady ground in order to expand itself. So here I think that this is an important maybe input, maybe it's not even a question to this discussion, but what seems to be efficient is always at the cost of something. Somebody has to take a slug. These are workers, this is an environment, these are costs basically externalized to other entities and not capitalists themselves. The question, of course, is how to change it. And would you have, because you for example, talked about algorithms and protocols, right? I guess that this is because you talk also about democratization of the workforce, and I guess this is one of the ways how to acknowledge this what currently is hidden cost of capitalist efficiency.
Yeah, I think, one way to think about how capitalism works is that Well, it's based on many people being, disempowered and insecure and just having to search for scraps of work. But then the people who do have power and resources, we just say to them, look, do whatever you want, make as much money as you can, whatever you need to do that. And then the state tries to put some regulations on it. They say, okay, you can use all these resources and blow off the tops of mountains, but make sure, you only add this much, toxic chemicals to the water. Like they try to corral and contain negatively what these businesses do with the immense resources that they
create
have.
Additional markets, like with carbon
exactly.
offsetting.
So there's these ways of like kind of corralling and containing the profit motive. That's what's available to the state to try to regulate the economy. And what I'm talking about is a world where the workplaces that have access to these immense resources of a modern society can actually use them to positively pursue multiple goals, that we would actually have like whatever it is, like, I don't know, people who work in industry, like positively trying to find ways to make their workplaces not just more efficient in producing whatever, I don't know, trains and stuff, but also more ecologically sustainable, like giving people an interest in trying to improve positively all of these different features of the world, rather than just, being corralled while they pursue their single goal of profit. And that is, that's, again, that requires, I guess, unlike the way capitalists talk about it, where there's like a price you can put on carbon, the idea here is that no, there's no technical way to balance efficiency against sustainability. These are inherently political questions. And that means that because they're political questions, we need to decide about them together, how we want to do it. In some ways, I would say, what I'm talking about, it's a little bit like what people are calling degrowth. In some ways. Like, I'm critical of that framework in certain respects, but I am talking about how do we get to a world where we meet people's needs and we give them this immense amount of security that opens up their worlds, but without relying on economic growth in order to generate that. But my difference from the kind of degrowth people is that I'm saying that even a society like that, it's still going to change. Even if it doesn't generate economic growth, it can still change because there's ways we can change our economy that make it much better, that don't result in an expansion of the amount of goods and services we produce. Like, if we take our resources and plant trees everywhere and make our cities beautiful and create shade in a hotter climate, that doesn't expand our economy because it doesn't expand the amount of goods and services we produce every year, but it certainly will make people a lot happier. If we go in and change the way work is done, so it's just as efficient as before, but now the workers feel like they understand what they're doing and that they have more control over it, that again is going to change the economy, but it's not going to result in growth. And so the kinds of technologies I'm talking about using, the algorithms and protocols and the democratic organization of society, it's aimed at creating a world that is efficient and sustainable and has justice and work satisfaction and so on, but it sees those as positive goals that we kind of pursue together in that way, rather than a profit-driven economy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also very skeptical of the degrowth discussion. I just think that this is politically completely unimaginable. Yeah. I mean, unless we have we have to deal with a major conflict or catastrophe, and people have to deal with the consequences of this. On the other hand, the point that is, I think, very important to be acknowledged is actually the limits of growth, in a sense of whether we are able to imagine this kind of society on a global scale. Because currently, what is happening is that we have, just in a moment of speaking, we have a very steered and tensed refugee crisis at eastern border of Poland. We have constantly constant refugee crisis at southern Mediterranean border of European Union. There are all the ethno-nationalists who promote walls as a way of protecting this kind of selected communities in order to in order to prevent others, people who are poor, who are starving, who cannot make their lives where they live, from entering into these pockets of a nice life.
Yeah.
So the question, of course, is whether we can imagine this kind of like nice life. Like we talk about basics, right? Like roads, sanitation, healthcare, and so on and so forth on a global level.
Yeah. I mean, in my more academic work, I work on the history of development. And one of the things that really had a big influence on me is that already in the 1960s and 70s, you had all these people looking at, this was an era much more interested in development and globally shared prosperity than our era is today. But at that time, they already recognized, look, economic growth is not the same as development. And in a capitalist society, especially one where there are so many people working in the informal sector, so many people with a very tenuous access to jobs, in a society like that, with a vast informal surplus population, people who can't find work, growth rates have to be so high before people at the bottom of society experience real benefits from that. And you have all these different countries where, even though growth rates were high, they weren't really seeing development. They weren't really seeing social and economic development for the majority of the population. And that's the kind of thing that we want. We don't want growth for its own sake. Thomas Piketty, the French economist, showed that in the past 40 years, global growth, the poorest half of the world's population only captured 12% of that growth, whereas the top 1% of the population captured more than double that share. I think it's like 27%. So just advocating growth as such isn't the answer. We need development. We need actual economic and social development across the world. And that would require a really big change in how we organize society. And yes, the big danger that we face is something like a future of eco-apartheid, right? A world where, especially in the tropics, the world becomes incredibly hot, migration and refugee crises increase, and instead of pushing forward towards a world of abundance, we go deeper and deeper into a world of scarcity, where even in the core that's protected, people feel very scared about losing access to what they need to live. And that kind of focuses people and makes them very much concerned with getting theirs and making sure other people can't take it away from them. That's a real danger for the future. And that's precisely why we need to think towards a kind of world, because we actually have the resources, the know-how, educated and urban populations, that are actually want to live in a better world, and we can use our resources now to start building towards that world. Because it's true, the alternative that we're kind of facing looks increasingly dire if there aren't big changes in the way society is organized.
Yeah, yet again, it's socialism or barbarism. And maybe there are some other questions. We have 4 minutes, and then I see that there are like at least 3 questions, but maybe we can start exactly with people who have not yet spoken.
Hi, thanks. There's some really positive stuff in that talk. Thank you. I wanted to ask about what you were saying earlier about UBI and how in the States some people were trying to link that to means testing. And I guess what I'm concerned about here is moving to a post-scarcity system where social needs are sort of democratically attributed to all the people, so everyone has their needs met. What happens when we have a whole society that's based on saying that some people mean less than others or aren't people? The US has been sort of built on slavery. We have a whole history of racism, sexism, people not being treated as human. And how do you make sure that everyone's needs are met and people are able to participate democratically so that they are? We have systemic disenfranchisement. We have a prison industrial complex. And across the world, this goes for things like other populations. We're talking about the refugee crisis. How do we make sure that everyone is included as a person with an equal stake in society?
Yeah, I mean, that is really the crucial question. And, I guess that
There's a philosophical concept of desert, and how do we break beyond that, I guess, is what I'm really asking.
Yeah.
It's not about deserving.
Yeah, how do we make sure that these things are really universal for all people? I mean, I'm very influenced by, someone who thought a lot about this, W.E.B. Du Bois, and his idea about democracy, which is precisely this idea that, we need to make sure that people have the opportunity and the means to really speak to their own suffering. That we not try to that we not live in a world where, we take certain people to be the representatives who are speaking for other people and explaining what's wrong for them. That, without going to a wholly relativistic worldview, we can just admit that often we need to listen to the people who are suffering themselves about what's wrong for them, not, experts explaining what their experience is. And that's why, in my view, and here maybe there's some aspects of it that are a little more complicated, but I think that building a kind of, really meaningful world where we meet people's needs, a kind of advanced realm of necessity, actually requires a very open and developed realm of freedom. It's only possible to really meet everybody's needs if people have free time and the capacity to organize in their free time around the issues that matter to them. Now, I think that when people's needs are met and when they kind of feel more free, they will take more time for rest and relaxation and just enjoying themselves. That's very important. But in a world where people feel that way, they're also going to want to spend more time pursuing the things that they care about. And for some people, that's going to be hobbies like model trains. For some people, it's going to be, expanding our world of knowledge by, joining societies for mathematics or like maker groups, inventing new tools and stuff. But for a lot of people, the things they care about are going to be political, right? They're going to have to be able to join associations and organizations that are fighting, even in a post-scarcity world, to try to transform how we understand what our needs are, so that we're better able to meet them. So the world I'm talking about would be one that's precisely a world where there's a lot of civil associations that can form and gain access to resources, where people, if they feel like their needs aren't being met, they can actually find ways to organize with other people to kind of press their needs on society. So it's a very political vision of a post-capitalist world. And I guess the reason why I emphasize that is I think that too often there's this idea that once we abolish class society and so on, this kind of beautiful dream, that there won't be any conflicts anymore, and that we'll just have a harmonious community that's internally coherent and knows itself as such. I think that vision is something that we really need to abandon. We need to think about what comes after capitalism as a very complex world of free associations, not as a harmonious community for precisely the reasons he said. Sorry, I went on too long.
And definitely, like this political associations is a condition of any kind of political change that would be a precondition of any kind of post-capitalist society. Yeah. But then there was another question, and it definitely won't be a bourgeois civil sphere that is going to lead us there.
Yeah.
The last one or the last two? Maybe we can gather a couple of. Michał says one. So the first,
Great.
signed, first served.
Thanks for your words so far. A lot of very nicely positive, though idealistic thoughts for the future. So very quickly, could you speak to kind of the tangible roadmap you see to reorganization? Whether that's kind of at a grassroots level, federal. I know this is now a whole larger topic, but.
Yeah, I can't speak to that quickly. I don't think that we're talking about these ideas in a vacuum. I think people are gaining interest in positive ideas like, the spread of even just briefly of fully automated luxury communism as an ideal, or all of these kind of more radical versions of the idea of a Green New Deal. People are actually want a future again. And they want it in part because the world is getting so bad, but also because we already live in a world where people are fighting all the time. Like even right now while we're having this conversation, there's a major new strike wave brewing in the United States, something that hasn't been seen for a long time. In 2020 in the US, we saw probably the largest social movement, the George Floyd rebellion in US history. In 2019, before the pandemic hit, we saw social struggles on every inhabited continent. We had major social movements across all these different regions and all of these different concerns being raised. So my view is that, we're already in a society on the move. And the idea is that if you want to see a better and different world, the point is that the way to get there is to immerse yourselves in the movements for change that are already happening. And often those movements, they are fighting defensive struggles. They're fighting to prevent a further erosion of what they have, or fighting against the fact that they have nothing and aren't, lack dignity and recognition in the eyes of society. And what we need to do is we need to kind of go into and join those struggles and try to push them, or push or develop or support the elements that are pushing for something that would be positive and transformative for the future. So again, the world this is already happening. We live in a world in struggle, and the point is to take part in it and kind of push it in this positive direction with the will and capacities that we have.
Okay, that's a very good conclusion of this short meeting. Thank you very much, Aaron. Thank you, Unsound, for organizing. Thank you all for partaking. Thanks for all questions asked and unasked. Thanks.